Have you heard of the Chinese game called Mah Jong? It's a game that's popular all over Asia. But did you know that it's also a game played by many Americans? I'm Grace Trafton of The Better Part. Stay tuned and find out about the interesting history of Mah Jong in the United States.
Welcome to The Better Part, a program that encompasses a diverse spectrum of topics important to our community, which we hope will both inform and entertain you. We invite you to sit back and enjoy the program.
Annalise Hines is a PhD candidate in history at Stanford University. After having taken Chinese Mandarin classes at Whitman College, she lived in Yunnan Province in southwest China for a year and taught English to graduate students at Yunnan University. Welcome, Annalise. Of all of the countless topics you could have chosen, why did you decide to write your PhD dissertation on the history of Mah Jong in the United States?
I first encountered the game personally when I was living in China. And I knew already that the game was popular in the United States. So I was very interested in how this happened. What does it say about cultural transfer and people coming together and kind of movement of ideas and objects and cultures across the Pacific Ocean? So I had that in the back of my mind. And then I learned the game when I was in China, really enjoyed it, in part because of the sensory aspect. The tiles feel good in your hand, they sound good on the table, and they're really beautiful. And so when I began my, my program, getting my PhD in history, I knew I was interested in the history of this connection between the United States and China. And I thought that this would be a very simple question to answer. How did Mah Jong become also an American game? And as I just scratched the surface, I realized that that question has been asked a lot, but there hasn't been scholarly work done on trying to answer that. There has been some really wonderful gathering of historical sets. People have put them online in a couple of really wonderful exhibits online, but it's a question that remains unanswered. And so the farther I scratched with the sources, the more I discovered this rich history. And the sources brought me to the 1920s, when the game was an incredible national fad in the United States.
Tell us about some of your experiences while living in China.
I lived in Kunming, which is the capital city of Yunnan Province, and I had a wonderful year there. It was challenging and enriching, and it opened my eyes in many different and unexpected ways. One of the remarkable things about Yunnan Province is the cultural diversity and the ethnic minorities, as well as the geographic and biological diversity that exists in that region. It's incredibly beautiful. And so I was able to travel to north of Kunming to Lijiang and places like Dali, where there are now tourist economies built around, in part, sharing these remarkable cultures of ethnic minorities in these regions. And as I traveled farther into the interior of China, as well as to Beijing, everywhere I went, I would hear the clicking of tiles. And as I talked to people a little bit about it while I was there, and they told me that during the Cultural Revolution, Mah Jong was actually outlawed for a brief period of time. Reformers, whether they are on either end of the political spectrum, often kind of reject gaming as this frivolous or corruptive activity. And so it was banned for a period of time during the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and 70s, and so people would make Mah Jong cards, paper cards, and play it because you could play it silently.
Right.
And,
Right.
But once that prohibition passed, they were playing with tiles again, in part because it is so satisfying
Right, right.
to hold and feel those tiles.
It is. And so can you tell us something about the origins of Mah Jong in China?
One of the myths of Mah Jong is this idea of truly ancient origins. And it does have a long history. It evolved out of much longer standing forms of games, both domino games and paper card games. But its history as this specific game is much more recent. It really is from the earliest probably more like late 19th century is when we start to see some stabilization of
So it's
that game
not
form.
ancient at all.
It is not. It's actually a very modern game.
It sounds like it.
And it became this global game very early in its history, and it is part of this modern, very much a global modern history. And I think that that's one of the interesting things about why this idea of it being an ancient game has stayed on for so long. And I think that there are different reasons for that. But in the early 1920s, when marketers were promoting this enormous American market for the game, that also changed its history in China. And people learned about this game, which previously had been located more just in urban centers. They were learning it farther in rural areas and in interior areas, in part because this massive explosion of the game and people talking about it, and they knew, the president and first lady of the United States were playing it, and it changed the way everyone was talking about the game. Whereas in China, it was no longer just one of many different kinds of games. This is kind of a national symbol now of China in the United States.
Right.
And that held important meaning, particularly in this moment in the 1920s when it's this new republican nation, it's after the Chinese Revolution. And in the United States, marketers were playing up ideas of this kind of ancient mystical Chinese culture with Americans who really didn't know very much about Chinese culture, but who liked this idea of an ancient Chinese court, who had heard of somebody called Confucius, and so then it gets attributed to him, even though he certainly didn't have anything to do with the game. So I think in these very different societies, that ancient story took root for different reasons, but it has held firm. And
well, this is an educational experience for me because I am one of those people who thought that it was an ancient game.
Yes.
So I learned something new today. Now, how did Mah Jong get introduced into the United States exactly?
In the 1920s, there were a few key entrepreneurs, as well as increasing tourist traffic, American traffic to and from China. But that's this moment of transfer. But it dates a little bit before that, where from the turn of the century, Mah Jong was becoming increasingly popular in these urban centers in China, and in Shanghai in particular, the game evolved in the region around Shanghai, and Shanghai in particular became the center of Mah Jong playing and then also production. It was also the largest community of Americans in China, which is still relatively small, but it was dramatically increasing in this time after World War I, when the United States was really changing its position in the world. And there was a growing group of Chinese middle class and elite people who could communicate with Americans in English, or some combination of Chinese and English, as well as then a growing group of Americans who were not only isolated in a kind of foreign enclave, but also interacting with with this growing group of Chinese middle class and elite people. And they were the Chinese middlemen, in some ways, were the first ones, I think, to put the numbers on the corners of the tiles, which helped and introduce it into these expatriate circles, that then could be brought farther into the foreign community that had been more kind of isolated just among Americans and British and French. And from there, some entrepreneurs, most notably Joseph Babcock, but also some other people, noticed how popular it was becoming among these Americans in social clubs in Shanghai and in homes, and tried to bring it and market it to the United States. And tourists were bringing it on steamer ships and writing home to their families about it. And once, particularly Joseph Babcock, helped create a company that focused on promoting and marketing the game, it very quickly took off like wildfire.
Really?
And then you have department stores like Bullock's in Los Angeles and Wanamaker's and Gimbel's having these elaborate store displays promoting Mah Jong along with a range of other Chinese goods. And this was also, again, during a time when people were just kind of like this idea of an exotic, consumable Chinese good without necessarily being very careful about how they were appropriating some of this. So all of it kind of got mixed up, and people were wearing kimonos and playing the game, which doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense now, but at the time it was all just part of this larger kind of Asian look. And wasn't that exciting and fun and exotic and a way to try out new things and new behaviors and kind of feel cosmopolitan. And it really spread across many different groups and classes. You have Spanish language newspapers in Texas advertising the game, and African American women in social clubs in Chicago playing the game.
Really?
And like I said, President and First Lady Harding and all the elites of particularly the coastal regions. But everybody for a brief period everyone was talking about this game, and it was really the in thing to do. And there was this large conversation also happening about what was going to happen with bridge, which kind of had been the game of classy people before, and people were putting their bridge sets away and focusing on mahjong as a la mode. So that's the roots of really where you see mahjong exploding in the United States. And Chinese Americans who had been here before the game spread widely in China often learned the game in Chinatowns and with Chinese American family and friends, but within the American context of this fad. So,
now, how have you gone about researching the American history of this game? What was your methodology?
One of the ways that I've done that is by doing a lot of oral histories, particularly for focusing on the time period during World War II and shortly after World War II through the 1950s. I've interviewed over 40 people about their memories of the game, some of whom actually are in their 90s and have rich memories even earlier than that, but especially in this kind of 1950s period when American mahjong takes on a life of its own as a different type of game. And so it's been wonderful to really get to hear people's family stories and individual stories. And I have a lot of people say, well, I can't tell you anything about the history, or I don't have anything, to say. I'm not an expert. I'm not important. And really, it's just that I want to get to hear their memories and their lives. And it's been wonderful. So that's been one large area of sources that I've been able to gather. But it also includes things like I went to the Parker Brothers Company Archives, which is now part of Hasbro, but they're based in Massachusetts, and that was a wonderful experience too, because their archive is a room where they've over the decades have kept quite a wide variety of things, but it's just a room off the factory floor. So they're still printing game boards and right over there, and then here's this room with old sets and photographs and scrapbooks.
Oh,
and
my goodness!
That that uncovers its own unique things that would never just come up if you're searching what's available online or even library catalogs. Even if people have written a lot about mahjong in their letters, for example, if they're lucky enough to be given to an archive and have an archivist keep them and record them, they might not note that Mah Jong is an important thing that we should categorize something by. So sometimes it also just takes targeting, like, okay, I know that person was in Shanghai at the right period of time. I know she has letters that she wrote home to her family, so I'm just going to go and read through some of those letters and see if I can find Mah Jong.
You know, that's really interesting about the history of Mah Jong in the 20s. I had no idea how extensive, Mah Jong was in that time period. Now, there were diverse groups of people who played Mah Jong in the U.S., from Chinese Americans in the 30s, San Francisco, to Jewish women in Brooklyn after World War II. Have you noticed any similarities or differences between the groups?
Yeah. One of the remarkable things I think about Mah Jong is how, even as it changes across various types of boundaries, geographic boundaries, the form of the game has largely, not entirely, but largely stayed consistent. And I think that the function of the game itself has also shared some of these core elements, in particular how it has built community in various ways, in various places. And in the 1930s, for example, second and third generation Americans were coming of age in an American context that still really saw them as perpetual foreigners. Even though they were Americans, they were born here, grew up in San Francisco, et cetera, the economic structure and the social structure still very much kept them at arm's length and associated them as unassimilable. And at the same time, within Chinatowns, which were then segregated from the larger population, especially on the West Coast, there were a lot of internal divisions and big generational divides. And Mah Jong was something that everyone could play together. And the structure of the game and the pacing of the game doesn't put a lot of pressure on that exact interaction. You don't need to even, you don't need to spill your guts to grandma as about what you did last night as you're playing the game, but you're still sharing that space and time together. And it was one of the few things that really families and very different groups could come together and share, and also at that moment share a cultural identity too. Now, what's known as American Mah Jong evolved over the course of the 20th century, and as I mentioned before, this heyday of American Mah Jong in the 1950s and 60s strongly associated with Jewish American women.
And how did that come about?
Right. Well, American Mah Jong has never only been played exclusively by Jewish American women. But at the same time, Jewish women have been the core leadership and entrepreneurs and game stewards who have really developed and led the game into this new form, particularly in the post-war era, in these communities that were emerging around New York, in these brand new suburban communities where people might be leaving more densely populated parts of the city, and suddenly in these neighborhoods where they are actually very homogenous. The whole neighborhood might be all young Jewish American families. And particularly then for women, and at this point, the leadership of, for example, the National Mah Jong League had already been women. So by this point, in the American context, the game was associated with women. But women found themselves in these new neighborhoods, sometimes isolated, sometimes not isolated in a negative way, but just needing to meet people where they had stopped working because they were raising young families. And Mah Jong was something that brought people together again, within a building, a single apartment building perhaps, or in a neighborhood, but also connected these various Jewish social networks that were circulating, like in the Catskills and between these neighborhoods, where people might learn when they go up for summer in the Catskills and come back to their neighborhoods and teach their friends. And it becomes then a marker of these often ethnically identified communities, in part almost because of the environment, where it's just they're learning from their friends who happen to be Jewish because their neighborhood is. And also then, like I mentioned, the game's leadership of the National Mah Jong League has historically been Jewish American women. And I can talk a little bit about the difference between the gameplays.
Yeah. What exactly is the difference between the way American mahjong is played and Chinese mahjong is played? There are some differences.
There are some, yeah. And I won't go into too much detail because I'm sure that the true gamesmiths out there will be able to tell you in more detail. In American mahjong, you play so that you're developing hands, specific hands that change every year. And this is a rule book from the early 1950s, but from Dorothy Meyerson of the National Mah Jong League. And you can see here, it's a very early kind of version of what would become the card that's most common today. And here she is laying out the different kinds of hands that you can make with the different tiles. And these were changing at the time, but not necessarily every year on the dot. Now we have these rule cards where instead of the Chinese way of playing, which is very, as you mentioned earlier, somewhat similar to gin rummy, and the points are very important as you create different types of hands, but each game you can create just any version of those types of hands that you can. In the American version, you are playing to create specific hands that are set and have different point values. And these are designed and change every year, and these cards are sold by the National Mah Jong League, and part of the proceeds of that go to philanthropy.
So tell me briefly some of the examples that you brought for us to look at.
Yes, about the tiles themselves.
Yes.
Well, so one difference that you'll notice right away is that these are modern Chinese tiles that I bought when I was in Kunming, and these are all different variations of old tiles from the 1920s. And so one of the main differences you'll see right away is in the Chinese tiles, there's no numbers on the corners except for these are specific parts of a flower suit, and so they have numbers for different reasons. But here, for example, this is the number 3. So there's people who are playing in China don't need the number 3 to know that.
Right.
But in American sets, you will always find numbers in the corner of what you're playing, so that people don't have to know the Chinese numbers.
And so these tiles are actually from the 20s.
They
right?
are, exactly. And I have a range of variation in terms of the quality and the detail that you'll see in them. But one of the main characteristics of a lot of 1920s sets is how it is constructed from bone and bamboo. A lot of people believe that sets that look like this are made of ivory, in part because marketers at the time like to encourage people to think of it as ivory. Right. But in fact, ivory sets existed, but were very, very, very rare. Mm-hmm. Most of these are made out of cow shin bone. Mm-hmm. And in fact, and they were made in Shanghai workshops and factories, particularly in the area around Shanghai, by hand. And it was a skilled craft, and there were specialists. So some people would fit the bone and bamboo together. Some people would carve the design. Some people would paint them. Some people would polish them.
So each one is done by hand.
Each one of these is done
and
by
carved,
these, yeah.
carved individually.
That's right.
Very labor intensive.
Very labor intensive, and it really did take a lot of skill. And during this incredible boom in the 1920s, that happened very quickly, the production could not quite keep up with the pace of demand, because each one of these pieces actually is a material that requires a lot of knowledge. For example, the bamboo has to be cut at the right time and aged for the right amount of time. The bone can only be carved out of a specific segment of a cow shin bone. So they ran out of the Chinese supply of cow shin bones because there were not as many cows in China.
Right.
They require so many resources. So they were actually shipping cow bones from the United States across the Pacific Ocean
Oh,
to
my
Shanghai
goodness.
to make these sets that were then shipped back to the United States. And skilled craftsmen were also in short supply for this specific skill. And so there are records of some of the workmen being able then to negotiate higher wages because they knew that these companies were in desperate need, but also were going to turn around and make a big profit from the sets in the United States. So each of these is made a little bit differently. You can also see this is a very high quality set. There's a big ratio of bone to bamboo, and a lower quality set has a much bigger piece of bamboo to that piece of bone, and you can kind of see too that the carving is not quite as detailed and fine as this one, and for this one there too, the cutting isn't exactly as neat. So there was a range in quality and in prices, and then this is actually an early this one is an early form of plastic. This one is wood.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah,
early
exactly.
form of plastic.
You know, some of the very early sets were made out of an early form of plastic, both in China and then some factories that started in the United States at the same time that didn't last very long. And this is a wooden piece that's been painted
It's a
black
black piece, which is very unusual, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. And by wood, I actually mean, I think this is all bamboo, but it's painted. So, yeah.
So what is the future of your project, and what do you hope to do with the book?
Well, after my dissertation, I plan to turn the dissertation into a book, and I am really hoping that that gives an opportunity to extend the conversation to give back to the people who I've interviewed in their communities, and also to learn more from people as I talk about either the book or in occasions like this, to hear people's stories and hear what they remember or old sets that they have. One of the things I've loved about this project is the conversation and the personal connection that is part of Mah Jong itself. It brings people together.
Well, Annalise, thank you so much for being with us today. This has been fascinating. And it has been an educational experience, even for me, a Mah Jong player.
It's been my absolute pleasure.
Thank you for being with us today. I hope you've enjoyed our program. And be sure to watch our programs on YouTube. See you next week on The Better Part. Bye-bye.
I'm flying high, but I've got a feeling I'm falling for nobody else but you. You caught my eye, and I've got a feeling I'm falling. Show me the ring and I'll jump right through. I used to travel single, oh, we chance to mingle, oh, now I'm a tingle over you. Hey, Mr. Paulson, stand by, for I got a feeling I'm falling for nobody else but you.